The radio chatter stopped at 1847 hours. Not with static, not with panic, just silence. The kind that settles over a battlefield when something has gone terribly wrong. 12 minutes earlier, Viper 3 had called in a danger-close fire mission on a fortified compound 3 clicks north of the Helmand River Valley. Now nothing. The Joint Operations Center at Bagram went cold. Screens flickered with drone feeds showing nothing but dust and smoke where an entire platoon should have been. The mission commander, a colonel with 23 years under his belt, leaned into the mic and tried again. Viper 3, Overlord, status check. Silence. He tried the alternate frequency, then the emergency channel. Outside, the sky over Afghanistan was turning that particular shade of bruised purple that comes just before full dark. Somewhere in that fading light, 32 Marines had vanished. What no one in that operations center knew, what wouldn't make sense until much later, was that the silence wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because 700 miles away, at a forward operating base most people didn't know existed, a pilot everyone had written off was already climbing into the cockpit of an aircraft that should have been retired a decade ago. Her call sign was Revenant. Most assumed it was because she flew the A-10 Thunderbolt II, an airplane the Air Force had tried to kill more times than anyone could count, a machine that refused to die. But the name had nothing to do with the aircraft. It had everything to do with what happened over Kandahar in 2019, a mission that left her grounded for 3 years and turned her into a ghost story whispered in ready rooms across 3 continents. Her real name was Kira Dalton, though nobody called her that anymore. 37 years old, 14 years of service, 247 combat sorties. A service record so complicated it had been sealed by people whose rank didn't appear on any public roster. She walked across the tarmac without hurry, flight suit faded from too many washings, helmet bag slung over one shoulder. The crew chief, a kid named Boone who looked about 19, watched her approach with the kind of nervous respect usually reserved for ordnance that might explode. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had. He just wasn't sure which ones were true. The weighting on the hardstand looked like it had survived a war with a metal shredder. Panels patched in 3 different shades of gray. Scorched exhaust stains bleeding back from the engines. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruding from the nose like the stinger of some mechanical wasp. 30mm. Depleted uranium rounds. 4,000 rounds per minute. The airplane wasn't built around a pilot. It was built around that gun. Everything else was just there to get the weapon to the fight. Kira ran her pre-flight inspection with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times the movements had become muscle memory. She checked the turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage, designed that way so the aircraft could operate from damaged runways without sucking debris into the intakes. She inspected the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit, armor thick enough to stop 23mm rounds. The triple redundant hydraulic systems. The manual reversion controls that meant even if everything else failed, she could still fly the thing home. The A-10 was ugly, slow, and obsolete by every modern metric. It was also unkillable, and right now, that's exactly what was needed. Ordnance? She asked Boone without looking at him. Full load, ma'am. 11 Mavericks, 2 Sidewinders for self-defense, full combat mix on the 30 mic. He hesitated. They said you weren't cleared for combat operations. She pulled herself up the ladder into the cockpit. They say a lot of things. The last radio transmission from Viper 3 had been clipped, professional, wrong. Overlord Viper 3, we have contact. Multiple, break, they're not, then nothing. The mission commander had replayed it 14 times, listening to the background noise, trying to parse meaning from the way the sentence cut off. Not they're not backing down. Not they're not where we thought. Something else. Something that made a Marine platoon leader forget to complete his sentence. Kira strapped in. 5-point harness. Survival vest. Pistol on her right thigh. The cockpit smelled like hydraulic fluid and old sweat, familiar as home. She powered up the systems one by one, watching the instruments come alive in the gathering darkness. The heads-up display flickered to life, painting green symbology across her field of vision. Tactical awareness displays showing friendly positions or where they'd been 12 minutes ago. Targeting pod slewing gimbal beneath the fuselage. Infrared sensors already scanning the horizon. She ran through the startup sequence with a precision that would have impressed her instructors at Laughlin Air Force Base 2 decades ago, back when people still believed she might wash out. She hadn't. The tower came through on the radio, a different controller now, someone who didn't know her. Revenant Bagram Tower. You are not cleared for departure. Repeat, not cleared. Stand down and shut down engines. Kira, release the parking brake. Revenant, acknowledge. She pushed the throttles forward. The two General Electric TF-34 turbofans spooled up with a rising howl that made windows rattle across the flight line. 700 miles between her and whatever had happened to Viper 3. At 350 knots, the A-10's maximum speed, nothing impressive by fighter standards. That was 2 hours of flying time. Except she wasn't going to fly at 350 knots. She was going to fly at 200, low enough to see the ground, slow enough to hunt. Because that's what the A-10 did. It hunted. The tower controller was saying something about court-martial proceedings, about violating direct orders. Kira switched frequencies. She knew the colonel in the operations center would be scrambling alert fighters right now, F-16s that could intercept her before she cleared Pakistani airspace. Fast movers with pilots young enough to be her students, flying aircraft that cost $90 million apiece. They'd pull alongside, try to wave her off, maybe even lock her up with targeting radar as a warning. She'd seen it happen before. She didn't care. The compound where Viper 3 had gone silent was designated Objective Widow, a cluster of mud brick buildings in a valley that had changed hands 17 times in the last 5 years. Intelligence said it was a weapons cache. Local informants said it was a meeting place for high-value targets. The Marines had gone in at sunset because that's when the enemy was supposed to be least alert, most vulnerable. Standard doctrine, proven tactics, everything by the book. Except the book was wrong. Kira climbed to 15,000 feet above the worst of the turbulence and pointed the nose south. The mountains of the Hindu Kush spread out below like crumpled paper, dark valleys where entire armies had disappeared throughout history. British, Soviet, American. The land didn't care about flags or doctrine. It just swallowed what it was given and waited for more. She checked her fuel. 3 hours of loiter time with combat reserves. The A-10 was designed for endurance, not speed. It could circle a battlefield for hours, waiting for the call, ready to deliver violence with surgical precision or overwhelming firepower, depending on what the situation required. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls, rechecking systems she'd already checked twice. Targeting computer, inertial navigation, laser designator. The Maverick missiles hanging under her wings each had a different seeker head, infrared, optical, laser-guided, tools for different jobs. The cannon had 1,100 rounds loaded, a mix of armor-piercing incendiary and high-explosive incendiary, enough to turn a convoy into scrap metal or carve a building into rubble. The A-10 wasn't subtle. It was a close air support platform designed by people who understood that sometimes the mission required bringing overwhelming violence exactly where it was needed and nowhere else. She flew over the Pakistan border without clearance, violating about 16 different international agreements. Nobody stopped her. The sun was gone now, only a thin band of orange on the western horizon. Soon it would be full dark. Night operations in the A-10 were challenging but not impossible. The infrared targeting pod gave her a monochrome view of the world below, thermal signatures rendered in shades of white and black. Hot engines, body heat, fires. She could find what she was looking for, but she had to get there first. At 1921 hours, a new voice came through on the emergency frequency. Young, female, strained. Any station, this is Viper 3 actual. We are pinned down. Critical casualties. Grid November Delta 278413. Need immediate CAS. Immediate. Then quieter to someone else nearby. Tell them to hurry. Kira checked the coordinates against her navigation display. Objective Widow, 93 miles, 26 minutes at current speed and altitude. She pushed the throttles forward slightly, coaxing a few more knots out of the engines, knowing every bit of extra speed cost her loiter time she might need later. The voice on the radio had that particular quality that comes from trying to sound calm when nothing is calm, when the situation has deteriorated past any contingency plan and into the realm where training and desperation blur together. Viper 3, Revenant, I copy your position. 2-5 mics out. What's your situation? A pause, the kind that means someone is making a decision about whether to believe what they're hearing. Revenant, Viper 3, who the hell are you? Where's our air support? I'm what you've got, talk to me. Another pause longer. Background sounds, weapons fire, someone shouting for a medic. Then, we walked into an ambush. Compound was rigged. Multiple fortified positions we didn't know about. Heavy weapons. They let us get inside the perimeter before they opened up. We have 12 combat ineffective, 3 urgent surgical, 1 routine. We're trapped in a crater maybe 15 meters across. They've got us surrounded on 3 sides. If we don't get air support in the next 30 minutes, we're all coming home in bags. Kira pulled up the mission brief on her knee board, the one she'd grabbed from the operations desk on her way to the aircraft. Objective Widow was supposed to be lightly defended. A handful of insurgents, small arms, nothing a platoon of Marines couldn't handle. Either the intelligence was wrong or something had changed dramatically in the last 6 hours. She suspected both. Viper 3 described the enemy positions. North side, heavy machine gun emplacement. Concrete reinforced, maybe a bunker, we can't tell. East side, multiple fighting positions in the second story of the main building. South side, open ground, but they've got marksmen covering it. West side is our only cover, but there's a creek bed and we'd have to cross under fire with litters. We're not getting out without help. Copy, I'm going to need you to mark your position. Infrared strobe. Already out. We've been strobing for 20 minutes. Good, stay on this frequency. I'll be overhead in 20 mics. Keep your heads down. She clicked off and switched back to the tactical frequency. The operations center at Bagram was a chaos of voices now, everyone trying to coordinate a rescue that had already failed once. Somebody was arguing about rules of engagement. Somebody else was pulling up satellite imagery. The colonel who'd been running the operation was silent, probably calculating how many careers were about to end, starting with his own. Kira ignored all of it. She descended to 8,000 feet, then 6,000. The radar altimeter started chirping warnings about terrain. She silenced it. The ground below was rising to meet her, mountains that topped out at 12,000 feet in places, valleys that could hide anything. She switched the targeting pod to infrared and started scanning ahead, looking for the thermal signature of muzzle flashes, engines, anything that would tell her what she was flying into. At 1937 hours, she saw the compound. Even on infrared, it was obvious something was wrong. The whole area was lit up with thermal blooms, not just weapons fire but larger heat sources, vehicles maybe, or generators. Far more activity than intelligence had predicted. She counted at least 40 distinct heat signatures moving around the perimeter, and that was just what she could see from this angle. Inside the compound, in the crater where Viper 3 was trapped, she saw the infrared strobe pulsing like a heartbeat. 12 combat ineffective, 3 urgent surgical, 1 routine, numbers that translated to bleeding Marines waiting for someone to save them. She armed the targeting computer and selected the first Maverick missile, AGM-65D, infrared seeker, fire and forget. She could launch from 3 miles out and the missile would track to the heat signature on its own. The heavy machine gun position on the north side was putting out enough thermal energy to be a perfect target. She designated it with the targeting pod's crosshairs, waited for the lock tone, and squeezed the trigger. The Maverick dropped off the left wing pylon with a solid thunk and ignited. White exhaust trail arcing across the darkness. 5 seconds of flight time. Then the north side of the compound erupted in a ball of fire that bloomed white-hot on her infrared display. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition cooking off probably. The machine gun went silent. Viper 3, Revenant. North position neutralized, working east side now. Revenant Viper 3, confirmed, good hit. They're repositioning, watch for. The radio cut out. Kira's radar warning receiver screamed to life. Missile launch. Someone down there had just fired a surface-to-air missile at her. She yanked the stick hard left, dumping chaff and flares, watching the infrared signature of the missile climb toward her. MANPADS probably. Shoulder fired. Not sophisticated, but deadly enough if it connected. The missile chased one of her flares and detonated 300 meters behind her. Close enough that she felt the concussion through the airframe. She rolled wings level and came around for another pass. The A-10 could take damage that would drop any other aircraft. She'd seen them come home with engines shot out, hydraulics gone, holes punched through the wings large enough to climb through. But that didn't mean she wanted to test the theory tonight. She selected another Maverick and designated the east building where Viper 3 had reported fighting positions. This time she saw the muzzle flashes before she fired. Someone down there was shooting at her with what looked like a heavy machine gun, tracers arcing up in slow motion. 50 caliber, maybe. Big rounds, but not big enough to get through the titanium bathtub around her cockpit. She ignored them and launched the Maverick. Another perfect hit. The second story of the building collapsed inward, thermal bloom washing out her infrared display for a moment. Revenant Viper 3, you're cleared hot on the south side. We're staying put. Copy guns. She rolled inverted and pulled the nose down, lining up on the open ground south of the crater. The targeting pipper settled over a cluster of thermal signatures, men in fighting positions, prone, waiting. She squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 came to life with a sound like God tearing canvas. 70 rounds per second. Depleted uranium penetrators moving at 3,000 feet per second. The recoil was strong enough to slow the aircraft. She walked the stream of fire across the southern positions, watching through the targeting pod as the rounds impacted in a line of explosions that threw dirt and debris 50 feet into the air. When she pulled up, the south side was silent. No more thermal signatures, no more movement, just craters and dust. Viper 3, Revenant, south side clear. You're clear to move west to the creek bed. I'll cover you. Revenant Viper 3, moving now. We have litters. This is going to take time. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She climbed back to 6,000 feet and established a wide orbit over the compound, watching through the targeting pod as the Marines began their extraction. Thermal signatures moving slowly, carefully, carrying their wounded toward the creek bed. It took them 9 minutes to cover 15 meters. 9 minutes of exposure, 9 minutes where a single remaining enemy could have ended everything. Kira kept the targeting pipper moving, scanning for threats, finger on the trigger, ready to bring the gun to bear on anything that moved. Nothing moved. At 1958 hours, Viper 3 reported they were across the creek bed and had established a defensive perimeter on the west side. Extraction helicopters were inbound, 20 minutes out. All they had to do was hold until then. Kira checked her fuel. 45 minutes of loiter time remaining. Enough. Barely. She stayed overhead, circling, watching. The compound below was a ruin now, buildings collapsed, vehicles burning. Whatever had been there, weapons cache, meeting place, ambush site, it was gone. And 32 Marines were alive because of it. She thought about the colonel back at Bagram, about the controllers who'd ordered her to stand down, about all the people who'd said she shouldn't be flying combat missions anymore. She thought about Kandahar in 2019, about the mission that had ended her career the first time, about the investigation and the sealed records, and the 3 years of flying a desk while everyone whispered about what she'd done wrong. She thought about the call sign Revenant and why it fit. At 2017 hours, the extraction helicopters arrived. Two CH-53s, heavy-lift birds escorted by a pair of Apache gunships. They landed in the creek bed, rotors kicking up dust, and the Marines loaded their wounded aboard with the efficiency of people who'd trained for this exact scenario. 3 minutes on the ground, then airborne again, heading north towards safety and medical care and debriefings that would last for days. Revenant Viper 3, we're clear, all personnel accounted for. A pause, thanks for the save. Just doing my job, get home safe. She turned north and began the long flight back to Bagram, alone in the darkness, fuel gauge creeping toward empty. The adrenaline was starting to fade now, replaced by exhaustion and the kind of clarity that comes after combat, when the world seems both more fragile and more precious than it did before. She thought about the young Marine who'd called in the fire mission, the one who'd kept her composure even when everything was falling apart. She thought about the crew chief Boone, who'd loaded her aircraft without asking questions he probably should have asked. She thought about all the people who'd survived tonight because an obsolete airplane and a pilot everyone had written off had been in the right place at the right time. The radio crackled. Revenant Bagram Tower. You are cleared to land, straight in approach, runway 21. Be advised, the base commander requests your presence in the operations center immediately upon landing. Copy, Tower. She smiled slightly. Of course they did. She'd violated direct orders, crossed international borders without clearance, engaged enemy forces in a combat zone she wasn't authorized to operate in, and probably broken about 40 other regulations she couldn't remember right now. There would be paperwork, investigations, possibly a court-martial, depending on how badly the Air Force wanted to make an example of her. She'd been through it before. She'd survive it again. What mattered was that 32 Marines would go home to their families. What mattered was that the mission succeeded. What mattered was that, when the call came, she'd answered. The lights of Bagram appeared on the horizon, a constellation of artificial stars in the darkness. She began her descent, feeling the weight of the aircraft settle as the airspeed decreased, the landing gear extend with a solid thunk, the wheels touch down on concrete with barely a bounce. Perfect landing. She'd done it 10,000 times. One more wasn't going to kill her. She taxied to the hardstand and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was deafening. Her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline withdrawal, nothing unusual. She unstrapped and climbed down from the cockpit, legs stiff from 2 hours of sitting. The crew chief Boone was waiting at the bottom of the ladder, looking at her with something that might have been awe or terror or both. They want you in the operations center, he said. I know. Ma'am, what you did out there was what needed to be done. She walked across the tarmac toward the operations center, toward whatever consequences waited inside, and she didn't hurry. Behind her, the A-10 sat cooling on the hardstand, scorched and battered and still standing, a machine that refused to die. She knew how it felt. The operations center was exactly as chaotic as she'd expected. Screens everywhere showing replays of the mission from multiple angles, drone feeds, satellite imagery, gun camera footage from her aircraft. The colonel was standing in the center of it all, arms crossed, jaw tight. He watched her enter without saying anything for a long moment. Everyone else in the room had gone silent, all eyes on the two of them. Finally, the colonel spoke. You disobeyed a direct order. Yes, sir. You violated controlled airspace, crossed international borders without clearance, and engaged enemy forces in a combat zone you were explicitly ordered to stay away from. Yes, sir. You also saved the lives of 32 Marines who would have died without your intervention. He paused. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to recommend you for a medal or a court-martial. Your call, sir. He studied her face for a moment, looking for something. Regret, maybe. Defiance. He didn't find either. What he found was a pilot who'd calculated the costs and made the only choice she could live with, and who would make the same choice again if given the opportunity. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We'll deal with this in the morning." She nodded and turned to leave. Behind her, someone in the operations center started clapping, then someone else. Within seconds, the whole room was applauding. Controllers and officers and analysts who'd watched her pull off a rescue that shouldn't have been possible. She didn't acknowledge it. She just walked out into the night, toward her quarters, toward 6 hours of sleep that probably wouldn't come, and toward whatever tomorrow brought. But first, she stopped by the flight line one more time. The A-10 was still there, crew chiefs swarming over it, inspecting for damage, reloading weapons, preparing it for the next mission. It had taken hits tonight. She could see the patches where shrapnel had punched through the wings, the scorch marks from near misses. But it was still flyable, still ready. Just like her. Boone looked up as she approached. "We'll have her ready to go by dawn, ma'am." "Good," Kira said. "I have a feeling we're going to need her." She walked away into the darkness, toward rest and tomorrow and whatever came next, knowing that somewhere out there, another platoon would eventually need saving, another mission would go wrong, another call would come through on the emergency frequency. And when it did, she'd be ready. Because that's what Revenant meant. Not a ghost. Not something that died and came back. Something that refused to die in the first place. Something that kept fighting long after everyone else had given up. The A-10 wasn't the only thing that was unkillable. She was proving that every day. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over Afghanistan and the endless war continued, she'd prove it again.